you to our webinar on respiratory protection. As we get started, I want you to know that I have not muted everyone's lines because we don't have as many people on. So you can interrupt and ask Tamara any questions you want throughout the presentation. If you want to, you can also use the chat feature to ask questions that Tamara and I will get to before the end of the presentation. If you require CNEs, please be sure to enter your name and the organization in the chat box so we can take roll. You will also need to complete the evaluation we send out following the webinar to receive your certificate. Our presenter today will be Tamara Rodriguez, Risk Management Consultant at Anthem Risk. Today's program has been approved for 1 CEU through the South Carolina Nurses Association. You must participate in today's webinar in its entirety and also complete the evaluation in order to be eligible to receive these credits. Anthem Risk is an approved provider for nursing continuing professional development by the South Carolina Nurses Association and accredited approver by the American Nurses Credentialing Centers Commission on Accreditation. A conflict of interest occurs when an individual has an opportunity to affect educational policy about healthcare products or services of a commercial interest with which she or he has a financial relationship. The planners and presenters of this CNE activity have disclosed relevant financial relationships with any commercial interests pertaining to this activity. Anthem Risk has conflict of interest disclosures on file for all presenters and planners. For the non-endorsement of products, provision of this education activity by Anthem Risk does not imply endorsement of SCNA or ANCC of any commercial products displayed in conjunction with this activity. SCNA gratefully acknowledges the support of companies to support the presentations of speakers. Commercial support does not influence the design and scientific objectivity of any SCNA educational activity. Today's learning objectives will be to state the 3 reasons why a respirator may be required, list the 4 different types of respirators, explain the difference between qualitative and quantitative fit testing. Now that I have read that fun educational information, Tamara, would you please get us started?
Yeah, good morning, Barbara and Clint. Thanks for joining us today. I appreciate your time. We're going to go all over respiratory protection and the entirety of the standard. I'm going to move through pretty quickly, but as Wendy said, please feel free to interrupt and ask any questions that you have as we move through. It's better if this is interactive immediately as you need. So just some quick statistics to get started. Pre-COVID, there were already 5 million workers who were required to wear respirators to work. And that accounted for about 50 million N95s a year that we consumed in the United States. The violations of the respiratory standard is the 2nd most frequently cited standards in 2021. It's always on the top 10. It's not surprising that it moved way up in 2021. Thanks, COVID, right? Which brings me to the next bit. COVID brought all aspects of respiratory protection into the forefront of the discussions about PPE. What is a respirator? What is a face mask? What are the difference between these two? And I just thought it was really interesting. The CDC says that during peak COVID periods that we as a country consumed 140 million respirators N95s in 9 weeks. So hence the supply chain issues, right? We went from 50 million in a year to 140 million in 9 weeks. You can understand where the shortage was coming from, and I'm so glad that it seems like the bulk of that has been alleviated. As Wendy said, these are our learning objectives. You're going to be able to state the 3 reasons why a respirator might be required. You're going to be able to list the 4 different types of respirators. And if somebody asks you, you're going to be able to explain the difference between qualitative and quantitative fit testing. What do respirators protect us from? Well, at the hospitals, you guys often end right at that first bullet point. That's where the discussion of respirators centers and oftentimes stops. So I feel like you guys have a lot of that well in hand. As medical professionals, you are far advanced from what I can advise on in reference to disease, infection prevention. But so today we're going to talk about the other bits more. There's lots of places in the hospital that can or do contain respiratory hazards that have nothing to do with the ill patient themselves. So where might we find some of those respiratory hazards? Well, if we're in the pharmacy, they're compounding medications, things like chemo, and a variety of other drugs. So they compound with hoods and vents and all different kinds of engineering controls, which is awesome. But if I had to compound that medication in a hood and then there is a spill or release of some kind between when it gets compounded and when it gets to the patient, who's going to clean that up? In the lab, they work with formaldehyde, of course, in very large quantities, but they also have media fixers. Some of those chemicals are really nasty. So got to pay attention to what kind of quantity you have of those chemicals and then what to do. Again, if there is a reasonably anticipated release or spill of that chemical. And then look specifically at your chemo, infusion, and dialysis units. Again, what happens if there's a spill? Did an eye wash and shower assessment a couple of years ago for one of our members and focus a lot in dialysis. A lot of those chemicals are extremely corrosive and have a variety of other negative health effects that go along with them. So it would be really strongly advised that you take a look at that unit, what they're doing, what kind of PPE they have, and make sure that their respiratory protection is taken care of as well. Then we have hazards in the environment. Chiller systems. Lots of chiller systems are run with anhydrous ammonia. Hospitals have very large refrigeration systems. I don't believe Self has anhydrous ammonia. I'm not sure about Conway, but it's definitely something to check out. What kind of refrigeration system do you have that deals with your walk-in freezers, right, which are usually quite large? The facility itself. That is a significant respiratory hazard. I don't know if you remember a few years ago in West Columbia, there was a lady who died because an anhydrous ammonia leak happened. A driver was filling a site's anhydrous ammonia system, filling their tanks. He used the wrong hose. The hose split and released, and the anhydrous ammonia cloud is heavier than air, which means it's going to travel along the ground. And that's exactly what it did. And a woman was driving by the facility and drove through it just the wrong time, drove into the cloud, which choked her car out and then ultimately resulted in her death. So really important to know if we have anhydrous ammonia in any large quantity at your facility. In your kitchens, you have gas and carbon monoxide, of course. Your loading docks, you're getting all kinds of chemicals all the time. And then in EVS, we have our storage and chemical filling areas. So again, making sure that the chemicals play nice with one another, that we're not going to get some kind of off gas that happens when I combine chemical A and chemical B so that I'm ready to go clean the rooms. Making sure that all of those things are looked at and accounted for, and a job hazard analysis has been performed of those things is going to be really helpful in identifying your respiratory hazards at your facility. In safety, we always attack everything using the hierarchy of hazard controls. You'll notice in this slide what is in the very, very bottom. Of course, it's personal protective equipment. And that's because that literally does absolutely nothing to help us with eliminating a hazard. Personal protective equipment is simply a barrier. And if you don't make the right PPE selections, it may not even be a very good barrier. But for work in our hospitals, really hard to do elimination or substitution when it comes to patients, right? You can't say, oh, you have that, you can't stay here. Doesn't usually work like that, at least initially. So we're not going to be able to eliminate patients. We're not going to be able to substitute people out, right? I can't swap out a pertussis patient for a toe laceration. Not allowed to do that. So really, we're going to focus a lot on engineering controls. If we're thinking back to COVID, there were a lot of great examples of engineering controls during that period of time. Those negative pressure rooms that your facilities group went around and put up everywhere and did an amazing job getting that ventilation system working, that's an engineering control. Additionally, if your facility segmented COVID patients in one particular area of the hospital, that would be an example of an administrative control. You're changing the way that somebody does something. And then at the bottom, we have our personal protective equipment, which in this case, for this class, we're talking about respirators. Engineering controls in general for respiratory hazards would be enclosures, confinement of the operation, getting that ventilation going, and potentially substituting materials or a process. So I used that EVS example earlier. We know because of our safety data sheets that chemical A and chemical B do not play very nice together, then let's substitute something for one of those two that gets along, right? Take the worry out. In our controlling of the hazard, we have our administrative controls. You can do regular preventative maintenance of your systems, particularly impactful for your anhydrous ammonia systems. Make sure that you're doing that PM on that. Job rotation is another example of a administrative control of a respiratory hazard. And then finally, with respiratory protection in particular, we can only go to respiratory protection if engineering controls are not feasible or while those engineering controls are being put into place. So what OSHA is saying with all of this is it can't be slap a respirator on everybody, don't fix anything in the environment. They say that they expect that you handle things as much as possible at the top end of the hierarchy of hazard controls, with PPE being your last option. What is required when it comes to respirators? Employers shall, that means must, provide respirators that are appropriate, applicable, and suitable for the task being performed. And when they have this respiratory program in place and have requirements, they shall establish and maintain all required elements of the respirator program. This flow chart might be a little hard to see. I recognize that the font's a little small, but it does a great job of showing the decision tree for what level of respiratory protection program that you need to have. If you'd like a copy of this later, please just say so in the chat, and I'll be happy to make sure that we get you a copy. But this is all about, is it required or voluntary use? And once we decide if it's required use, what kind of respirator we're having versus voluntary use, what kind are we allowing, will drive what areas of the respiratory protection program need to be put in place. So let's talk about required use. Respirators are required under a set of particular circumstances. So if you have done airborne monitoring and you have determined that there are chemical, biological, or radiological contaminants over the permissible exposure limits, then you would be required to have a respirator. If the atmosphere is immediately dangerous to life and health, or could be, right? So we know that we have an oxygen deficient atmosphere. That's an IDLH atmosphere. If we have the potential for a hazardous atmosphere, then we have to go in and pretend as if it's IDLH until we can walk that back. Example that I gave is an ammonia leak in a 2,000-pound ammonia system. If you know that your room contains a cylinder with 2,000 pounds of ammonia and an alarm has gone off notifying you that you have a leak, but you don't know if that leak is a tiny amount of ammonia or the entire 2,000-pound tank let go, then you have to treat that as IDLH until you know better. Please require it. If I, as the employer, say, you will wear a respirator when you do X, Y, and Z, I don't have to have monitoring data. I don't have to have an IDLH atmosphere. I have just decided that that's what you're going to do. Then that is now required. Almost all standard elements apply when a respirator is required. So does the sniffometric create a respiratory obligation? No. And should we use it? No. We want to rely on all of these areas for development of our respiratory protection program and not these. Our sniffometric, lots of toxic substances do not have olfactory warning properties, and some that do can't be detected until they are over the permissible exposure limit. Then, of course, people have different levels of sensitivity to smells. And then we have olfactory fatigue. So in the chemicals that do have an odor, you can go nose blind to it. Folks who maybe had a smoker at their home, a person who smokes all the time in their home, they may not notice the smoke smell, but you as a visitor, when you come in, that's the first thing you smell. Dogs are another great example, right, of olfactory fatigue. We get used to how our dogs smell. Other people, however, they're going to notice. So we don't want to use the sniffometric as the foundation of anything. When we do have a requirement, we'll need to develop our respiratory protection program. It's going to be written, site specific. So you can take a canned program. South Carolina OSHA has canned respiratory protection programs available on their website. However, you're going to have to fill it out and make sure that it's site specific. It needs to be implemented and updated as necessary and run by and evaluated by a qualified program administrator. So the administrator has to have training or experience appropriate to the complexity of the program. So if you have a really simple program where you just allow employees to bring in what is a dust mask, lots of folks are going to be able to handle that kind of administration duties for that level of program. Now, how about if I'm at a scuba dive center, right, where we have tons of different air tanks? What if I'm a firefighter, where we have a mix of our cartridge respirators and we have supplied air respirators and we have all kinds of things about medical grade air and I mean just literally everything in the standard. We need to make sure that the person who's in charge of that program really knows the ins and outs of the program and of the requirements. Another thing in your respiratory protection program, you need to make sure that at a minimum, the title is in your written program for the individual who's supposed to be your administrator. Better if they're named specifically. And again, make sure that they have the bona fides to support their role within your program. You're going to have to prove that they know what they're talking about and that they are appropriate to lead that kind of program. You're going to have to show that justification if OSHA were ever to call you on it. And is this something that they're looking at on every inspection? Absolutely, particularly in light of COVID, right? Our respirator program requires 9 different items. We'll go through those here in just a few more minutes, so I'm not going to spend any time on them now. So this is what's required if we require a respirator for any of those reasons that we talked about before. Now let's talk about voluntary use. Voluntary use is only if it is not required by anyone for any reason whatsoever. whether it's the employer who doesn't set up a requirement or OSHA doesn't have a requirement because we're not over the permissible exposure limit, things like that, then that's voluntary use. They can be, in the case of voluntary use, they can be provided by the employer or they can be brought from home by the employee. Either of those is fine, but we do have to make sure that we are giving them a copy of Appendix D. If we are going to use filtering face pieces only, so i.e. a dust mask, right? Not an N95. This is a filtering face piece, okay? You would have to get a copy of Appendix D. If we're going to use voluntarily any other type of respirator, they have to be given, the employee has to be given a copy of Appendix D. They will still have to go to a medical evaluation that you will have to provide, and you are responsible for making sure that they know what the maintenance procedures are for their respirator. I am not a fan of voluntary use of respirators, particularly in light of the last couple of years. At peak COVID, folks, because of supply chain issues, were grabbing anything that they could find, which may not have left them in good stead in terms of actual protection. So I'd be really careful about allowing folks to bring in their own respirators or allowing the voluntary use of respirators. We are responsible for selecting respirators. And of course, we have to have aces in their places, right? All this is saying is don't put somebody in a full face cartridge respirator to mow the grass because they have allergies. At the same time, you're not going to give the pharmacist who's compounding chemo a dust mask to handle that issue, right? Make sure that we are matching everybody up with the hazards that they are going to be encountering while they are wearing that piece of respiratory protection. How are you going to make this selection? Well, you're going to identify and evaluate those respiratory hazards. This is going to be what's reasonable, what you think that people will get into. This is not anything and everything that can possibly be identified, right? This is just the things that we anticipate potentially running into. And you want to identify through the safety data sheet the chemical state and the physical form of that particular chemical. And if we can't identify or reasonably estimate the exposure that we're going to have, this is what I was telling you before, the atmosphere has to be considered IDLH. The respiratory protection standard is one of those where you go in with the highest level of protection, and then when you can document, you come down, okay? Our respirators must be NIOSH certified, must. That is a requirement. South Carolina OSHA and federal OSHA never took away the requirement of certification of respirators. They did have an allowance that went through the FDA of respirators that could be considered in addition to, but everything has to still be NIOSH certified. And remember, respirators are not one size fits all. If you've ever had the opportunity to order respirators, you'll know that even those N95s come in small, medium, and large. And as an employer, you have to offer a sufficient number of different models and sizes to achieve a proper fit. You'll want to make sure that you have your arms around exactly what's being offered and to whom it's being offered. That will make things much easier when it comes to supply chain issues, so you know which employees might be affected if there are limited amounts of a particular respirator. It's also very helpful when you're doing your fit testing to know what they were approved for last year so that we can see if it still functions, or if we've identified another product that is similar but not exactly the same. So you're going to have several different options available for folks. When it comes to the different types of respirators, As I said in the beginning, there's really 4 types, but they're broken down into 2 broad categories. So we have respirators, and under the heading of respirators, we have 2 types. We have loose fitting and tight fitting. And then underneath those 2 headers of loose and tight fitting, we have air purifying respirators versus atmosphere supplying respirators. So the 4 types are loose fitting air purifying, loose fitting atmosphere supplying, tight fitting air purifying, and tight fitting atmosphere supplying. And we're going to see some examples of those now. So here's our tight fitting respirators. These are all purifying the air. Back to our last slide. So none of these are supplying their own air. And then we have our loose fitting respirators, and in this case, they are all providing their own air. None of these are doing particulate filtration. These are some more examples of air purifying respirators. So it could be powered, it could be not, but the item here is what is doing the particulate filtration. Oh, sorry about that. Let me go back. We have a standard cartridge full face respirator, and then we have our N95. And this is not 95, sorry, this is a dust mask. And then we have our atmosphere supplying respirators. These supply the user with breathing air from a source that is completely independent of the ambient atmosphere. So supplied air respirators and self-contained breathing apparatus are the 2 examples of this. So once you've decided what kind of respirator you want and need your employee to wear, then you get to decide if there's any add-ons that need to go with it as well. So what would you pick? Don't know, right? Totally dependent on the situation. When we're selecting filters or respirators in general, make sure that you know that there are 3 classifications of filter. So there's N, meaning that it's not resistant to oil, R, meaning that it is resistant to oil, and P, they're oil proof. Then we talk about efficiency, 95, 98 for HEPA filters, right? And this is about how much leakage there is. So an N95 respirator is telling you what about that respirator? Somebody go ahead and break in. Tell me what that means if a respirator is labeled as an N95. Well, not everybody at once. So what an N95 stands for is that it is a respirator that is not resistant to oil and is capable of filtering out 95% of particulates. So it's exactly what that's telling you. If we're working with external filters and additional pieces to our respirator, we need to make sure that we are aware of the change schedule considerations. You know, how heavy are our work contaminants? How concentrated are they going to be? How frequently am I using this respirator? Think about the temperature and humidity and airflow through the cartridge or the canister. How hard is someone working? Is it heavy, intensive work? Or is it more sedate work, right? Are we working at the hood compounding things, or are we outside in this heat in South Carolina in August trying to deal with a problem with our ammonia refrigeration system, right? Those are 2 different things, and we're going to burn up that cartridge faster the faster we are breathing. And then if we've had a chemical in our environment that has damaged our respirator, potentially occluded it, we would need to make sure what those kinds of things are so that we can deal with them should they occur. We always want to err on the side of caution. We're going to anticipate the worst case scenario and use that as a change guide, right? If we're trying to guess, is this filter good anymore? Is it not good anymore? We have to ask, It's just consider it not good and move on and get a new filter. The manufacturers will tell you the change protocols for their different filters, so you'll want to follow that as well. And then document how you've arrived at your change schedule, and make sure that you have the supporting documentation for that, because again, that's a performance based, so you would have to explain why you've made the choices that you have made, or the respiratory program administrator will. So make sure you got somebody who can answer those questions. Do we think we need to get rid of this filter? Seems like it is time for this one to go, right? And that could have been an hour, or that could have been 2 weeks. Just depends on use. Another required element is the medical evaluation. We have to do that before we fit test our employee. It is a questionnaire that's in Appendix C. You're going to provide that to the employee. They're going to fill it out, and then you're going to provide their filled out questionnaire to a physician or licensed healthcare professional for evaluation. The employee has to be given the opportunity to have a discussion with the physician or licensed healthcare professional about the circumstances that surround their respirator use. Make sure that they can ask questions of that person. When you are arranging for the medical test, medical evaluation, make sure that you give them a copy of your respirator program and the safety data sheets that go along with anything that you anticipate that the employee will be exposed to. Notice I said an annual medical evaluation is not required. That's per OSHA standard. Is it a good idea? Sure, it's a good idea. When do we have to do one? Well, we have to do one when we know or suspect that there could be problems. So if I took my fit test last year, and then in the next 6 months, I got diagnosed with high blood pressure and I gained 50 pounds, might a medical provider want to see me before they allow me to go in a half-face cartridge respirator? Yeah, they should want to see me, right? That may have changed things. Not necessarily, but it is worthy of evaluation. Some potentially unsafe medical conditions that can be identified through the process are listed here on the slide. Claustrophobia and severe anxiety are really interesting ones. We had an experience with that when I worked at South Carolina OSHA. We were having some hazardous waste operations training. One of my colleagues volunteered to go into a level A suit, which, you know, is like the full Oompa Loompa suit, right? The whole 9 yards. And we were doing medical monitoring while he was in there and all of this kind of stuff. And he was doing fine, blood pressure fine. And then when they put the hood up and zipped it up, within about 10 seconds, he was clawing, trying to get that thing off. He had no idea that he was claustrophobic or that it would cause him any anxiety. He was 40 years old. He said that's the first time in his life that that had ever happened. So really good to know before he was in the situation where he might need that level A suit, right? That's part of the purpose of the physician or licensed healthcare professional checking. Additionally, some things that you want to give them, you want to let them know the type and weight of respirator that the employee will probably be wearing, how often and how long an employee might be using it, how physical the work effort might be, any other PPE equipment that they might be wearing. Are they wearing a bunny suit? Are they in a level A? Are they just in their normal work clothes? Identify any kind of temperature and humidity extremes that they may be dealing with while wearing the respirator. And then, of course, give them a copy of your written respiratory protection program. And I always think it's a good idea to give them a copy of the OSHA standard too, including the appendices. The medical provider is going to do some additional evaluations if the employee reports medical problems related to wearing that. If the physician or licensed healthcare professional or their supervisor informs an employer that they think that the employee needs to be reevaluated. If when you're doing the fit test, you see some things going on, or maybe you can't get a good seal, may have decided that it's time to get another medical evaluation, or if there's a change in the workplace condition that would potentially substantially increase the stress on an employee. And when I say stress, I'm not necessarily talking about mental stress, I'm talking about physical stress. Will I be working in environments that I did not anticipate working in prior? Fit testing. Two types of fit testing. There is qualitative and quantitative. Some general requirements when it comes to fit testing. If we're going to have a tight-fitting face piece, the employee has to pass appropriate fit test before it's actually used. Whenever a different respirator is used, right? So even if I'm using an N95 that came from 3M and is model number 3780, but we ran out of 3780 and we have 3781, you have to fit test them again, right? Because we have been cleared for 3780, not 3781, and they are different. And we have to do our fit test at least annually. So an employee could potentially be fit tested 3 times in a year, pretty readily. When we're doing the fit testing on in your program and in any discussions that you have, you might as well tell folks that they are going to need to go ahead and shave their facial hair. This is not different in South Carolina, other than we literally have a letter that says facial hair is not allowed. Some folks want to argue that you can still get a good seal while you have a respirator, when you have a respirator and facial hair. That is unreliable at best, right? So make sure that people understand that there is an expectation that they be clean shaven when they are wearing their respirators, their tight fitting respirators. So another area to keep in mind are safety glasses. We can't have our safety glasses on that interfere with the seals and elastics around here, right? If we have any kind of facial scar, we have a piercing, a nose, a cheek, a lip piercing. Make sure that none of that is going to interfere with the areas where we're trying to get a seal, and make sure that the employee knows that we need to do a seal check with every use. So more about our 2 types of fit testing. First, we have qualitative fit testing. This is a pass-fail test, of course, that relies on the person wearing the respirator to give you a response, right? There are the list of chemicals that you're allowed to introduce for the fit test are listed there on the right. But this is a requirement of an interaction between you and the person that you're fit testing. So, and it doesn't tell you if they're not telling the truth, or maybe they just don't know. Doesn't give you a great idea of what someone's actually exposed to under ideal conditions, right? Because if you're in employee health and you're getting your respirator fit tested, that's pretty near ideal conditions. As an employee, I'm probably not going to put it on better than I do for the person who's evaluating how I put on my respirator. So even with all of that, you still don't get a good hard decision on what exactly the level is that the respirator is protecting to. And the way that you would get that is through quantitative fit testing. This numerically measures the amount of leakage in the respirator. So this is not going to be a straight up pass fail. You're going to have data that goes along with this. You're going to have a port count machine or some negative pressure machines, and it is going to introduce the provider will introduce the contaminant into the environment. You go through a series of steps while the monitoring hose is attached, and it will tell you exactly how much you got through. These systems are really great, particularly for documentation and support of your respiratory protection program. But something else that I saw it being really useful for, particularly during COVID and when we were having supply chain issues, it allowed for pretty easy records management. Most of these different quantitative fit testing products come with pretty heavy computer software that can do a lot of stuff. So it works really well. So to help you see if Kelly was approved for respirator A, and now all we have is B, you can move her over to B. You can pull a list of everybody who was fit tested for respirator A that you know that you're never going to be able to get again, and tell them, hey, before we really run out, come and get tested for one of these other respirators and see if we can find one that works for you before we're literally out. So it is a really great way to document with hard numbers what's going on with your fit tests and with your employees. And it is not odd for an employee to have to try more than one respirator. I do have an example of an employee who had attempted 3 separate respirators at her place of employment and reported being able in the qualitative fit test to continue to taste the irritant. So a friend facility offered to come and let her be tested at their facility where they did quantitative fit testing. She brought with her the respirators from the facility that she had tried as a qualitative fit test, brought those with her, and then they provided a couple of others. And sure enough, she needed, I think it was 5 separate respirator tests before they found one that works for her. And that was hard and fast data with the quantitative fit testing. Good information to know. Maintenance has to be discussed with your employees. Make sure that they understand all the parts and pieces to the respirator and how it has to be treated. All of that information can be listed in, or not can be, is listed in Appendix B2 of the standard. Make sure employees know how they are supposed to clean their respirators. OSHA requires that they be cleaned as often as necessary, of course, before being worn by someone other than the original user. Then they have to be cleaned after we've had emergency use, after we're fit testing, and after we're training on them. Going to have to be cleaned. Is this what maintenance and use looked like for part of 2020? Yes. Now, per the CDC, in May of 2021, they issued a statement that says the supply and availability of NIOSH-approved respirators has increased significantly over the last several months. Healthcare facilities should not be using crisis capacity strategies at this time and should promptly resume conventional practices. I'd encourage you to check out NIOSH's CDC and NIOSH's page on respiratory protection if you're getting any kind of pushback about respirator use and how they are designed to be used at this point. Make sure folks understand how they're supposed to store their respirator. Doesn't seem like a very quality storage method in that photo to the right. There's all kinds of things that will degrade a respirator, so make sure that they know what those are. They have to understand what to check when inspections are required and what exactly to test on the different types of respirators. Of course, we have to provide training to employees who wear respirators. We have to provide that training prior to their use, annually, and anytime there's a change in circumstances or type of respirator, and anytime the employee shows that they need refresher training. So if an employee had been trained on the use of an N95 and they are walking around the facility and the upper band is around their head and the lower band is hanging down here like a tentacle, they might need retraining, right? So they have demonstrated that they need refresher training, you would be required to give it to them. Again, if we're doing voluntary use only, dust mask only, Appendix D will suffice. Employees have to demonstrate their knowledge. I put them through some questions, whether it's a computer-based module, whether it's a little quiz that they fill out while they're there getting their respiratory fit test done. Make sure that they understand why they're wearing the respirator, when they have to wear it, how does it fit, use, maintain, Make sure that they know all of those things. How often am I supposed to wear this N95? Well, this often. How often am I supposed to throw it away? Because have that changed a little bit? That's changed a little bit in recent years. So make sure that everybody knows what the requirements are. Make sure folks know the limitations of the respirators that they're wearing, how to use it effectively in an emergency, how to inspect it, put it on, use it, and check the seals, how they're going to maintain and store it, what signs to look for to recognize if they're going to be having some distress or circumstances that might limit its use, and then just the general requirements of the standard. These are all things that an employee should be able to demonstrate to you. So how do you do that demonstration? Well, I told you, either orally, in writing, or by observing hands-on use. So which respirator is this lovely gentleman able to wear? A, B, or C? So this is a C situation, right? We can wear loose fitting because we don't, that no exception for facial hair for either of the other two tight fitting respirators. That is a B only. We do have to reevaluate our program on a regular basis. What does that look like? It looks like conducting evaluations of your workplace to make sure that you have covered everything in your respiratory program that you think you've covered and that is present on your site. You should regularly speak with employees, those who are required to wear respirators, to ask them about how effective is the program, do they need anything else, and having the ability to correct any issues that they say, right? There is no strict fixed schedule for reevaluation. Do I think it's a good idea to look at it annually? Yes, I do think it's a good idea to look at it annually, but you may need to do that more frequently than annually. So let's have a little bit of fun with respirators. That's a quality respirator right there. I mean, maybe it's eye protection as well. I'm not sure. For real ad. My favorite part of this ad is that the wearer can talk, eat, and smoke while they wear it. I mean, because nothing protects us like wearing a respirator over our snoot while we smoke. Another great face mask. Not sure. We can use it as a shower cap or an apron, maybe a turban. It's supposed to filter things. Any questions from anybody? Quick reminder that our next webinar is going to be on August 9th at 10 o'clock, and we're going to be going over job hazard analysis, what that process is, what that looks like, and why you might want to do it. Before we take the thunderous amount of questions that I'm sure that we have, I want to thank you for your time and remind you, please don't forget to complete the survey. I really appreciate your feedback. We all do here at Anthem. I only want to give classes that are worthwhile for your time and that you enjoy having. If you have any topics that you'd like us to cover, feel free to put that in the chat as well. But with that, I'll open the floor to questions.
Hey, Tamara. Good morning. It's Kim.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm so good.
Good. Okay. I got one and it couldn't be more perfectly timed. We had our human resources team reach out to us yesterday. We have a nurse that's going to be joining us who is allergic to saccharin, and just in the past few weeks has had some major allergic reactions to some oral stimulants. Provider has written a note that she cannot have the Bitrix, the saccharin, anything. And she was fit tested just about 2 years ago with the same equipment. I tried to look through the OSHA standards, and just what I can find, it looks like we could utilize the previous fit testing if it's the same equipment, but just wanted to get an opinion.
Fit test is required annually. I think it's a little dicey to say, oh, it's the same, and she was okay then. that's going to be dicey at best. That puts the burden really heavily on you. Have you gone through all of the options that are listed in the appendix to make sure that she can't have any of those?
We did. I offered that yesterday and she took to her medical provider, and we actually received a note today from the medical provider that they want no type of stimulant or I'm trying to say Bittrex, saccharin, smoking,
Right, no
anything.
outside stimulant. Did
Yep.
they list a period of time that?
They have not at this point, but the reaction, whatever she had secondary was just like last week. So, and we're due to start her. She's a floor nurse and due to start next week.
I would be really hesitant to move forward with that. I mean, other than understanding that you're taking that onus on yourself, I would always be trying to push that envelope of, can she be tested now? Can she be tested now? Because if her weight has fluctuated at all, that makes it hard. That changes the effect on your face. There's a variety of things that could leave her less protected. So I would be careful about that. If you're really strong on wanting to let her start next week, I might call the standards office and potentially ask for a concession. See if they're willing to give it.
Yep, that sounds good. We were just looking at what alternatives, like I said, we have of course, an exemption from the physician, but that may not meet what OSHA wants. So this is a new territory. I've never had anyone that could not have any of the stimulants. So good. Just want to pick your brain. It was perfect timing.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's hard. That's a hard situation, but I just feel like OSHA's going to say, well, then she should not be in areas that require a respirator, which is going to be really hard, right?
It is. Thanks, Tamara.
Sure, of course. Anybody else? Hearing none, I will turn it back over to Wendy. Thanks so much, everybody. It was so nice to be here with you today. Hope you got something out of it.
Great, thank you, Tamara. So yeah, I don't see any other questions in the chat feature either. So make sure you please complete your evaluation. It has been put into the chat by Janine. So that's on the SurveyMonkey link there. We want to thank you all for participating in the webinar today. And don't forget, we do have our job hazard analysis webinar coming up on 8/9 at 10 a.m. So we'll let you all go. And thank you so much for attending.